Dr. Seuss's Scrambled Eggs Super. I don't like to brag, and I don't like to boast, said Peter T. Hooper. But speaking of toast, and speaking of kitchens and ketchup and cake, and kettles and stoves and stuff people bake, well, I don't like to brag, but I'm telling you, Liz, that speaking of cooks, I'm the best that there is. Why, only last Tuesday when Mother was out, I really cooked something worth talking about. You see, I was sitting here resting my legs, and I happened to pick up a couple of eggs. And I sort of got thinking, it's sort of a shame that scrambled eggs always taste the same. And that's because ever since goodness knows when, they've always been made from the eggs of a hen. Just a plain common hen. What a dumb thing to use, with all of the other fine eggs you could choose. So I decided that, just for a change, I'd scramble a new kind of egg on the range. Some fine fancy eggs that no other cooks cook, like the eggs of a ruffle-necked salamagooks. A salamagooks? Say, they should be good, so I went out and found some as quick as I could. And while I was lugging them back to the house, I happened to notice a tussle-topped grouse in a tree down the street, and I knew from her looks that her egg and the egg of the salamagooks ought to mix mighty well, ought to taste simply super. Then scrambled, put together by Peter T. Hooper. So I took those eggs home and I frizzled them up, and I added some sugar, 2/3 of a cup, and a pinch of pepper, and also a pound of horseradish sauce that was sitting around, and also some nuts. Then I tasted this stuff, and it tasted quite fine, but not quite fine enough. To make the best scramble that's ever been made, a cook has to hook the best egg ever laid. So I drove to the country, quite rather far out, and I studied the birds that were flitting about. I looked with great care at a mop-needle finch. I looked at a beagle-beaked, bald-headed grinch, and also I looked at the sun-roosted quail, who is roosting right under a lax tail, and I looked at a spritz and a funnel-wig jay, but I just didn't stop. I kept right on my way, 'cause they didn't have eggs. They weren't laying that day. Then suddenly, boy, up that hill, a short space birds. They were laying all over the place. Great happy gay families and uncles and cousins, all laying fine strictly fresh eggs by the dozen. Why, I'd have a scramble more super than super. Scrambled egg super de duper de booper. Special deluxe a la Peter T. Hooper. I picked out the eggs in the most careful way, and I only picked those that I knew were grade A. I only took eggs from the very best fowls, so I didn't take eggs from the twiddler owls, 'cause I knew that eggs from those fellows who twiddle taste sort of like dust from inside a brass fiddle. I went for the kind that were mellow and sweet, and the world's sweetest eggs are the eggs from the queet, which is due to those very sweet trout which they eat. And those trouts, well, they're sweet 'cause they only eat wogs, and wogs, after all, are the world's sweetest frogs. And the reason they're sweet is whenever they lunch, it's always the world's sweetest bees that they munch. And the reason no bees can be sweeter than these, they only eat blossoms of bezelnut trees. And these bezelnut blossoms are sweeter than sweet, and that's why I nabbed several eggs from the queet. But I passed up the egg from a bird called a strudel, who's sort of a stork, but with fur like a poodle. For they say that the eggs of this kind of stork are gooey like glue, and they stick to your fork. And the yolks of these eggs, I'm told, taste like fleece, while the whites taste like old bicycle grease. The places I hiked, the roads that I rambled, to find the best eggs that have ever been scrambled. I hunted new birds along wild tangled trails, through gullies and gulches, down dingles and dales. I wriggled my way and I crawled at a creep, through a forest of ferns that was 40 miles deep. And I mushed through the brush till I found a fine quigger, whose eggs are as big as a pinhead, no bigger. Then I went for the eggs of a long-legger quong, Now this Kwong, well, she's built just a little bit wrong, for her legs are so terribly, terribly long that she has to lay eggs 20 feet in the air as they drop with a plop to the ground from up there. So unless you catch them before the eggs crash, you haven't got eggs, you've got long legger hash. Eggs, I collected 302, but I needed still more. And I suddenly knew that the job was too big for one fellow to do, so I telegraphed north to some friends near Fazol, which is 10 miles or so just beyond the North Pole. And they, all of them, jumped in their catamasside, which is sort of a boat made from sea leopard's hide, which they sailed out to the sea to go looking for grace, which is a sort of bird that lays eggs on the ice, which they grabbed with a tool known as a squitch, because those eggs are too cold to be touched without it. And while they were sending those eggs, I got word of a bird that does something that's almost unheard of. It's hard to believe, but this bird's called a pelf, lays eggs that are 3 times as big as herself. How that pelf ever learned such a difficult trick I never found out, but I found that egg quick, and I managed to get it down out of the nest and home to the kitchen along with the rest. But I didn't stop them, because I knew some ducks by the name of single file Zum and Zucks, who stroll single file through the mountains of the Zums, quite oddly enough with their eggs on their thumbs. And some fellows in Zums whom I happen to know just happened to capture 1,000 or so, and they wrapped up their eggs and they mailed them by air, marked special delivery, handle with care. I needed more helpers, and so for assistance I called up a fellow named Ali long distance. And Ali, as soon as he hung up the phone, picked up a small basket and started alone to climb the steep crags and the jags of Mount Stuco to fetch me some eggs of a Mount Stuco cuckoo. Now these Mount Stuco cuckoos are rather small gals. But these Mount Stuco cuckoos have lots of big pals. They dive from the skies with wild crackling shrieks, and they jabbed at his legs and they stabbed at his cheeks with the yammering, clamoring, hammering beaks. But Ali, brave Ali, he fought his way through, and he sent me that egg, as I knew he would do, for my scrambled egg super D duper D booper special deluxe a la Peter T. Hooper. In the meanwhile, of course, I was keeping real busy collecting the eggs of a 3-eyelash tizzy. They're quite hard to reach, so I rode on the top of a ham ika shinin ika shinaman ika scoop. Then I found a great flock of southwest facing cranes, and I guess they've got something that's wrong with their brains, for this kind of crane, when she's guarding her nest, will always stand facing precisely southwest. So to get those eggs wasn't hard in the least. I came from behind, from precisely northeast. And I captured the eggs of a grickly gruckus, who lay 'em up high in a prickly cactus. Then I went for some ziffs. They were exactly the stuff, but the ziffs live on cliffs and the zuffs live on bluffs. And seeing how bluffs are exactly like cliffs, it's mighty hard telling the zuffs from the ziffs, but I knew that the eggs that I got from the bluffs, it wasn't a ziffs from the cliffs, it was a zuffs. Now I needed the egg of a moth-watching sneath, who's a bird who's so big she scares people to death. And that's this awful big bird, well, the reason they name her the moth-watching sneath is 'cause that's how they tame her. She likes watching moths, sort of quiets her mind. And while she's watching, you sneak up behind and yank out her egg. So I got one, of course, with the help of some friends and a very fast horse. If you want to get eggs you can't buy at a store, you have to do things you never thought of before. Why, I get the egg of one very small dwarf, We had to pry all of the mountaintop off. Then I heard of some birds who lay eggs, if you please, that taste like air in the holes of Swiss cheese, and they live in big zimber trees. So I ordered a treeful. The job was immense, but I needed those eggs, and said, hang the expense. I still needed more, and I saved it for last. The egg of a frightful bombastic aghast, and that bird is so mean and that bird is so fast that I had to escape on a Jill Ickerjast, a fleet-footed beast who can run like a deer, but looks sort of different. You steer him by ear. All through with the searching, all through with the looking, I had all I needed, and now for the cooking. I rushed to the kitchen and placed where I stacked 'em. I rolled up my sleeves, I unpacked 'em and cracked 'em. I shucked 'em and chucked 'em in 99 pans. Then I mixed in some beans. I used 55 cans. Then I mixed in some ginger, 9 prunes and 3 figs, and parsley, some quite sparsely, just 22 sprigs. Then I added 6 cinnamon sticks and a clove, and my scramble was ready to go on the stove. And you know how they tasted? They tasted just like, well, they tasted exactly, just like scrambled egg super, deep duper, deep booper, special deluxe a la Peter T. Hooper.